hope you had a nice 10 minutes break. I'm going to share something funny with you before we start with Q&A, because our third talk by Philip was about from third world to first. So a good friend of mine once told me that, the book, right, from third world to first, right, actually it's a very good book because it has two very important users. I was like, what two important users? So he told me that, first, because it's, it's a very thick book, right? It's actually a very nice tackle for a bookshelf, because like very thick one, like so when you hardcover thick books, you have third word to first, and yellow pages. So you make your bookshelf look very nice. But the second, even funnier use that my friend shared with me is that, it's a very good, very thick book. Actually, it's actually a very good book weapon. So, if you like that with your friend, you use the book to your friend's face. So, anyway, without further ado, let's start our Q&A. So, I thought when you ask a question, maybe you introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then just make your question short. Yeah. So, we need to check it first.
We just need one.
My question is, I'd like to find out what your take is on Koh Keng We's recent talk about the PAP. Since you mentioned that the new generation of PAP have moved away from the socialist path.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the question, if people didn't hear, what was my thoughts about the recent talks by Koh Keng We? I don't know. I mean, for me, it seemed they raised one or two interesting ideas, but they weren't actually fully substantive in terms of shifting the story in any major kind of way. So I was sort of warmly interested in them, but I wasn't I didn't think they were fully revisionist. It seemed they were sort of cautious, I would say cautious little bits of unpicking of various elements of the story rather than something more radically different. I don't know if anyone else has. Sorry, it's a bit of a vague answer. Do you have something that you thought was important about them?
I like that comment. I'm just about to pass the mic to someone.
You have to ask the question.
Okay. I just wanted to say something about for Keng We, the audience factor. A lot of the myths that were about Raffles and the writings of him. The intended audience. I think a lot of these wonderful things about Raffles only came probably in the centenary, right? So, the audience is not meant for the Asiatics of that time. I mean, they can say it, but a lot of these books and they're all mostly anecdotal. So it's not really history, but more on hearsay. I mean, you read a lot of those. I often, when I read it, I actually see that they're aimed at the British of that time, and just after the terrible war, and to enforce or to reinforce the morality of keeping the empire together. I think that of course later on, then that's what I want to say. The other thing I wanted to comment was that actually British throughout, I think even in Raffles' time, I think he was seen as a bit of an oddball because for Georgian society to come to the east really is to be a nabob, to live it up and to have as many courtesans and to have a very good sex life and things like that, which you see in the paintings, of how people lived it up. And Singapore Beach Road was the Mayfair of Asia, and so it was a pleasure place. So I often feel that British opinion or colonial opinion of
differentiates? Yeah, I would agree with your comments, and I think the sort of the light of Raffles interpretations, we have to look at the different interpretations according to the context, and and what I didn't really talk much about, and I feel a bit bad about not doing it, it's the way also it goes beyond the centenary. I think even up to today, the official historical narratives about Singapore overlaps a lot with the image of Raffles that was presented in these earlier narratives. And yeah, I think only recently, I think last 5 to 10 years, there's been increasingly questions asked about these narratives.
Hi. My question, I'm Gary. I'm currently a visiting researcher at US.
The Netherlands. Yeah, so I mean, that's just one example. But the 19th century, I don't think I'm qualified enough to talk about it, but that's something that's worth looking into, the different meanings of free trade. And then you can even push it further back, the 17th century, the idea of the freedom of the seas. I think you can look at the work of Peter Boschberg and others about the conditions in which the arguments surrounding the concept of the freedom of the seas came up. And the same person was to argue a few decades later against certain, to rephrase that freedom in a different way when the Dutch were in the ascendancy. Because the freedom of the seas came up in terms of Dutch challenging the Portuguese claim to sovereignty over the seas. But when you come to the late 17th century, the middle 17th century, when the Dutch were becoming ascendant, and the British were challenging their claim to the freedom of navigation in the seas, they redefined it again differently.
Thanks, Gary, for the question. I think you're right to point out that the kind of complexities of civil society, which can be an entire undergraduate course itself. And I think basically what I've been referring to is probably just a segment of it. You would say that colonial civil society was probably that which the groups that I had talked about were the more what you would talk about, what would you claim to be probably more bourgeoisie, more legitimized, using the official mainstream channels in the recognized media, especially the English language media, through the Straits Times and Singapore Free Press back then, town hall meetings in the main cities like Singapore, Kuala Lumpur and Penang. And I think more importantly, the legislative council assemblies too. So these are the very Europeanized modern versions of civil society engagement, which many groups today are still using through their MPs, still writing petition, polite letters to the papers. And that in contrast to other groups that I think it should be researched too into vernacular groups from other ethnic minorities whose voices are not being recognized, whose medium of exchange was not in English and therefore not detected, who did not use the same structures or did not learn from the same structures as probably like the comparator classes like the Straits Chinese Association. So this is one area that has not been seen, or even when they were being detected, it was associated probably more with Chinese or regional nationalist movements, be it Chinese, Malay or Indians. So there is another of this aspect that the British would have probably considered to be slightly more, not probably slightly, a lot more radical, a lot more probably subversive, which the the contemporary post-colonial PAP government had probably assumed such suspicions of some things, especially from the vernacular background. So, for example, in contemporary Singapore, I don't think the ISD would have take files on the Nature and Heritage Society. But you know, when it comes to Chinese schools, Chinese education, when it comes to things of considered to be primordial, communalism, cultural associations, that takes on a different kind of attention. So I think we're talking about, I'm very glad you pointed out different kinds of civil societies, different kind of publics too here.
Hi, I'm George from NTU. I have a question for Dr. Holden and later another question for the three speakers. So my first question for Dr. Holden is the from third world to first myth a conscious effort and strategy of the political leaders, or a minor part of a larger political play that's happening in the region as a whole? And the second question for the three speakers is that are the discussions meant to rethink, the discussions today, meant to rethink and provide parallels to existing myths, or to engage in a meta discourse on the linear nature of myths? Thank you.
The first question is very easier, so I'll take that. I think for me it's something like this. I think the notion of movement to third world to first has a certain kind of regularity and a very large spread. So it didn't originate with the political elite, but nonetheless, maybe a member of that political elite, and maybe the most key element of that member of that political elite, could crystallize this and put it in a certain kind of form, which was then repeated. So I think the relationship between larger social myths and what a leadership does is actually a complex, it's a two-way one, right? The second one, the second question, as I understand it, right, you're saying, are we trying to challenge the linear nature of myths in general, right? Or are we just, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because I'm quite confused when I see the topic linear narratives.
Yeah.
So in terms of trying to engage in the discourse, are we looking at specific examples and saying that there are parallels that we could re-engage in? Or is the discourse one step further upwards, which is a higher order analysis of why are myths linear?
I think it's difficult. Probably each of us has to answer that individually. The topic itself was, I think, just a way of organising three talks together that seemed to be about linear narrative. So we didn't discuss beforehand about how this would work. For me, I think I would be interested in questioning linearity. I think it can be done in different kinds of ways. And even if you go back to Keng We's talk, there's Koh Keng We and people like that have talked about if you envision Singapore's history as a series of cycles rather than an upward progression, that does something different, right? So my own contribution, I guess, was slightly in that mode. Supposing we think of, rather than upward progression, a fall, and then a fall from which possibly you can rise again, how would that actually work? And for me, it's merely not to say that this new narrative is better, but merely that I think thinking about these narratives that we take for granted every day in our lives, that we don't analyze, it's useful to realize how unconsciously we're structuring our lives. And so that's why it's useful to try out different kinds of narratives. But I don't know what my two colleagues think.
I think you just answered my part probably, but yeah, I totally agree with you. In terms of the questioning the linearity, and yeah, I was trying to emphasize certain of these cycles that were there before, but I was also, and I think I didn't do a good job of that, I was also trying to see what's new, despite the cycle. So maybe you can call that linearity, but it's what maybe, if I can go back to one of my teachers in Hawaii, Michael Wong Twin, he called the spirals of history. His ideas of spirals is to sort of capture the cyclical and the linear aspect of it. I don't know whether you see this as wordplay or but it's something that I think historians, when you deal with a certain, I mean not just historians, when you deal with the historical narrative, you're always concerned with this continuity and change dimension, the dialectic between the two.
So thanks for the question. I'm not sure whether maybe the whole purpose here is to give you the Singapore Flyer experience in the intellectual sense. To show the kind of cyclical nature of history. I think we have discussed about issues that have been brought up in the past, that it's not just straight progress from rags to riches, from the fishing village to the metropolis, but something more than that, some stubborn issues that perhaps, humanity has to deal with it in a humble way, or humanity should be, or people should be humbled by history in a certain respect. Just think of J.R. Turi has done a good job in the Chinatown Museum. So if you go in there, you would have the glimpse of how terrible life was in the colonial era. But actually, you don't need to go to the Chinatown Museum. You just need to follow the Ministry of Manpower raids into workers' quarters to see how squalid the same conditions are. And the same issues that have faced the colonial administrators continue to face the post-colonial republic too. So I think this is why we're trying to have a kind of more historical understanding in that idea of history that goes beyond perhaps the kind of lenses that maybe a state narrative would see. And maybe this is probably our job in providing such perspective, but helping us to look at things perhaps in different ways, and perhaps in ways that would allow us to see beyond the kind of pyramids that we are surrounded by. That there is probably more to it, that to kind of detect the undercurrents through looking at the past instead of looking at technological futures, which I think especially for myself coming up from communication school, that we are so easy to be seduced with the latest gizmos in solving the ancient problems of humanity.
Can I just quickly, since I'm not a teacher, and three of you are teachers, but when you meet students and when you interact with them, do you get a sense when you talk to them that they have a sense of history? You know why? Because when I meet friends and then I go to these dinner parties, and then we have conversation, and when we talk about our lives, I would often then reflect on something which, say, my grandparents had told me or something about the past, making certain comments about it. But I wonder, and then, I'm quite amazed that a lot of my friends would not have that family background to tell them about something of the past. I don't know why. I mean, this is something which I find quite remarkable. Yeah.
I mean, my own experience with my students is I think they do have certain knowledges of history. It may be something that happened in the family. It may be things that they've learned at school and they've sort of had national education, that kind of thing, so Singapore history. But it's often a kind of dead letter. It's things they've memorized that they sort of know. And it's, I think, back to like when Liew Kai Khiun said, these two names or these dates that you know, and things like that. And in some ways I'm quite lucky because I teach Singapore literature, and the way I actually go about teaching it is to say, we're going to look at something that you think you know quite well, but we're going to look at it at stories people have told about it. And I actually teach my Singapore literature class, and I get sort of mixed feedback from this. And I also feel uneasy about it myself in some ways, because I actually do start in the colonial period, and I start with straight Chinese writing in 1890 and 1900. And we go all the way through. We look at the way writers represented for emergency, living through emergency, from the Chinese community, from English-educated writers. We look at how they dealt with issues in the developmental state. And the problem I have, of course, is that I can't teach them as contemporary literature, and there's a lot of contemporary literature going on that's really interesting. But I do find my students are actually quite keen to engage with these issues, and they kind of get excited when they kind of realize that history is not a dead letter, and that they're actually active process of interpretation and of coming to own and know history, and they can do that through storytelling. And so I'm quite optimistic, actually, about my students, at least.
Well, I've only been back 6 months. But I think for the classes I've taught, I think most of the people have a sense of their past, but I mean a sense of past, a sense of history, but the question is like how the history is framed. I mean, it's not necessarily in terms of the nation or in terms of issues that we discuss here or in conferences and all that, but it's in terms of their own everyday experiences. And sometimes maybe they have the impression that history comes to big age. It's something formal, but it's a matter of telling them, convincing them that every part of their lives, even today, is history. I mean, a lot of some students in Korea I teach, they say, my memory, I have bad memory, so I was never good in history. Yeah, but I mean, it's not so much about memory, but about seeing things around you. I think, yeah. So it's a matter of engaging them to frame the past experiences around them. Yeah.
I guess for myself, although I'm in the communications school, we do have courses, and I do have modules, especially with references to history and heritage. And I would also assume that the very fact that the students have reached to that level in the tertiary education, they must have got their national education right. They must have done their dates correctly. And that, but what has been interesting, you know, from the days that when I was a history student, looking 20 years ago, just studying history of the Cold War and regional histories, looking at events and dates, is that the current generation, those students in their late teens and the 20s, are in this period of what I would call the memory turn. So there's a lot of emphasis on memory and heritage, not so much of history. I think that's something that Royston Tan did, that gave them the whole template of looking at the past in terms of very sepia images. So it's about doing projects in Dakota estate, you know, hanging out the hipster cafes, doing heritage projects on my grandmother's cuisine and my neighborhood Tau Sapia and issues like this. So it's not really the kind of formal history, but more on trying to dredge out memories for, I think, a generation that is seeing the kind of rapid changes around them. I think that the kind of urbanization has intensified for the last 10 years. Buildings are getting younger, places are disappearing faster, and maybe it's the scarcity of the markers of the past that gives them the value. And I'm quite proud to say in some ways that many of my students have gotten jobs from such projects.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to respond to this, and also just to share that we all can help create history, in a sense that my mom is participating, she's in her 80s, she's participating in the National Library Digital History Project, and when they came to interview her, they're going to be putting on a video for her. I was very surprised that she could remember her school song about 70 years ago. The school song of, primary school. I can't even remember my secondary school song, but she could remember her primary school song. But surprisingly, this young man who came to interview her does not know what a bucket system is all about, because my mom told him that when the Japanese surrendered, the Japanese would make you do manual work, including, disposing of all this feces in the buckets, but this young man was not familiar with this system at all, So I think such a history project is really worth recording, so that we can actually share some of these memories of this generation, the pioneer generation who's going to be passing on soon. So I think if we have a chance to participate in some of these memory projects, I think we all should take part. Thank you.
There's actually a quite interesting article in a book Kai Khiun edited about archives and memory, right? By Kevin Blackburn, a historian at NIE. And one of the things he actually says, which I think is very true, is that a lot depends on the context in which these memories are retrieved. And sometimes you can have a certain series of questions where people end up, or even just a kind of dominant sense, where people end up almost fitting their experiences into a standard kind of narrative rather than actually questioning it. And that's what's fascinating for me is how could you get memories of the past that somehow start to question or were not always, and people almost feel an urge. Like my mother-in-law right now is writing a kind of memoir, and we talk about it whenever I come around a bit, and she's, it's kind of funny because at times she tries to fit it into a Singapore story, but there are other elements which actually don't fit in when you talk about it a bit more, that don't fit into that at all. So I think you're absolutely right about these notions of wanting to participate in memories. All memories are precious and important. But I'm also kind of curious about, can we have ways of retrieving memories and of acknowledging memories that are not, that don't automatically assume that people's stories will fit into a certain kind of template. And that's a bit more difficult to do.
I think one of the most interesting history or memory projects that I was asked to do was in my undergraduate year in anthropology. We were asked to do a draw a family tree and compile our family history. But we were asked also to read ethnographies from different parts of the world and to relate our family histories to those different ethnographies that we chose. One of them was Upper Nanking Street, but I also remember things like the Nuer in Africa and other places. But I think it brings, this project was interesting for me because it brought me into my contact with my own past and my family's past, and I tried to relate it to Singapore history, but it also got me thinking out of the box to think of how our experiences, our family's experience, our histories are, how they compare to other parts of the world. I think Philip's presentation has brought up a lot of these very interesting parallels. We can use Victor Lieberman's word, strange parallel between different parts of Asia, Africa, in terms of events, experiences, and activities and so on.
There are also, I think, memories that are mainstream, and there are I mean, like what Philip talks about, how difficult it is to fit into the kind of official narrative. So, you know, there is also such groups out there, such initiative like the 50/100 committee that thinks about alternative remembering of Singapore's 50 years. So we have submissions of projects like, unfortunately Chikian is not here, the Find Generation. So interviewing parents or people who are the third kid during the stop at 2. I mean, that it's no fault of yours. To show that your parents were fine, but you also grew up fine, perhaps. So already we have voices like, you know, like my auntie was telling me she was not well educated, and therefore she was placed at the stop at 2, you know. But when she had more kids, every time she goes into the maternity ward, the nurse would scold her and call her like, why are you behaving like a soul, you know, like pig, you know, you keep reproducing, you know, the kind of humiliation, you know, that takes place, and, you know, how can you talk about such things? So it's actually what probably they said, the context, you know, how do you bring up the right platform? If you just put a mic with someone in Orchard Road to say, what are your memories? Of course, they will come up with something that is more official. But I think the challenge is not, I think ad nauseum, you know, that the kind of platforms about memory projects now. But how do we bring out those that are more repressed, more, something that is not that easily brought out. So you need a level of trust, a level of confidence, and the right context to do it. I think that's a bigger challenge, and that's probably the art of memory retrieval.
Sorry, I'd just like to ask another question. I mean, this question may be a little bit more philosophical, but I just want to know, because you guys come from diverse background, And we know that the linearity nature is very much in the natural sciences, and in social sciences we are also trying to struggle with that. I'd like to know, in your perspective, how this linear epistemologies have affected your disciplines, and do you think that it is, what do you think is the way forward for your respective disciplines?
My discipline has always been a very confused discipline. Nobody really knows what we're doing, right? Which in a way is not a bad thing, right? But we've also, historically, first of all, English studies itself has a very strange history, and literary studies has a very strange history, and even in Britain. In Singapore, it has a particularly contested and strange history because it's the history of literature and a language which was not seen as Singaporean for a long time. So I think, in terms of, in my discipline, in terms of issues to do with linearity or epistemologies, I think hopefully what my discipline actually does exist to do, I would think, is to actually get people to think about the way they construct narratives. And not just, many of my colleagues would just concentrate upon literary narratives, narratives maybe high cultural narratives, but I think increasingly people are moving towards thinking about all the cultural narratives we have. How do we construct these? And I've become particularly interested in questions of autobiography and how we, as individuals, we make stories about ourselves, and those are our identities, and how they relate to larger social stories. So I'd hope my discipline will go in that kind of direction, or at least some people in my discipline will go in that kind of direction.
For me, it's not my discipline that's confused, it's just me who's confused. Because my background is both a bit of sociology, anthropology, and history. I think one of the worst fears in these disciplines, well, at least from my perspective, is to be said to be teleological, to be linear. And I think we tend to try to avoid taking a linear perspective. But I might be misrepresenting my field.
I guess I've always been known to be academically promiscuous. You probably can see my writings ranging from history of trade unionists to K-pop artists. And communication school is actually quite a new field. But I think you're right, linearity is not just a discourse, but it's tied to an entire institutional culture. It determines whether you get the jobs or not. You have to show to be faithful to your job applications, that you have not strayed, and even this is how you get placed into departments. This is how you get placed into institutions and getting funding as well. But I think probably the situations, they talk about interdisciplinary, a lot, but I'm not sure how much has changed. But I guess this is how, if we continue to kind of toe the line, we just be very unhappy creatures in academia. I don't think this is what we went in for in some ways.
Let's say a few words about the history discipline and historiography of Southeast Asia in general, in a way that I agree very much with Liew Kai Khiun, that actually the history discipline in a way is to some extent conservative, in the sense that a lot of attention is actually placed on a nation-state or nation-based history, especially when it comes to Southeast Asian history. I think one reason is because of the linguistic training that you need in order to study Southeast Asia. Like, for instance, if you study, say, the history of Thailand, you need Thai, and of course, if you study Vietnam, you need Vietnamese, French, and so on. So, because of the linguistic and also because of the nature of the local nation-state boundary, that's why historians tend to study in a way more nation-based thing. As also when it comes to the job market, usually they will be higher according to the region that they specialize in. But of course, on the other hand, I think that how the historiography of Southeast Asia of Asia in general has shifted in a way to talk about to go beyond the linear narrative, not to talk about just about nation-based history alone, but look at the nation in a way, different trajectories in a sense, and as what Khiun We talked about, like a lot of different ways to understand what is this so-called in the making of the nation. And of course, this scholarship also has shifted very much in the last, say, 10 to 20 years with more attention on like transnational history. That has shifted very much from more nation-based history, like by scholars such as Banyan Anderson talks about more of nationalism and nation, to more of transnational, looking at connections and translocal networks and so on.
Maybe with that, it might be time for us to wrap up, because I notice people are looking quite tired at the back, and there's some nodding heads. So yeah, I'm going to let you do it formally, right? Yeah.
Sure, there's one last question.
I just have a quick question about both of you. I think Philip, you talked about how narrative kind of help us form stories about ourselves and possibly form identity of what we are as well. Yeah. I think if you look at it at a national level, especially as G50 is coming on, we obviously are taking a certain type of narrative to form our identity of what Singaporean is. Because when I travel and go with those people hopefully will know where Singapore is. I have like a default story to tell. So obviously, narratives of living with myths is really a series about trying to look at other stories from other perspectives, pretty much going against the grand narrative as built up, let's say, postmodernism. So I'm just wondering if with all these different narratives that are out there, if we were really consider how would that change our sense or everyone's sense of Singapore identity, for example? Because then there will be a much conflict between the official story and the many other stories. Just for example, the latest documentary that was made of people who are not Singapore anymore. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a big conflict for the identity of Singaporeans, or as we are building up our own identity. So I'm just wondering how does this multiple narrative would actually affect Singapore?
Yeah. So my own response actually, we were talking about this actually in break, and I think one thing that's, people talk about uniquely Singapore, and then we try to find what's uniquely Singapore, and it's difficult to find. But one thing that maybe is slightly unusual about Singapore is that in most post-colonial nation states, that narrative of progress pretty quickly got derailed, but it didn't carry on. In Singapore, it carried on for a very long time. It seemed economic growth was carrying on for a very long time. And so I think, in a way, we've almost forgotten the fact that it's normal for nations to have different stories. And it's normal for any one point of time for people to have, there's loads and loads of different stories and different ways of seeing the nation. That's quite okay. And it doesn't, I think having these different stories, this argument about storytelling isn't divisive. I mean, it can be divisive, but it's not necessarily destructive. And in a way, I think it promotes a certain kind of social resilience. If you actually have people talking all the time from, different views about when the past actually works. So I don't see it as being a problem. I actually see it as being an asset as Singapore now celebrates its 50th anniversary next year.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking our three speakers for the very wonderful just a reminder, our next seminar is on the 18th of December, so hope to see you next month. Have a lovely weekend. See you soon.